This week on the Palestine Pod, we were joined by Lena El-Malak to talk about her new book, Stolen Nation: The Right to Reparation of Palestinian Refugees. Lena is a legal consultant with expertise in tech law, data privacy, public international law, and refugee law. And prior to pivoting into a commercial legal career, she worked as a consultant for NGOs and UN agencies such as UNRWA, the UNHCR, and the ILO. She has a Bachelor of Civil Law and a Bachelor of Common Law from McGill and an LLM and a PhD in International Law from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. We hope you'll enjoy our discussion. Lena, welcome to the Palestine Pod.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Lena, your book, Stolen Nation: The Right to Reparation of Palestinian Refugees, focuses on the rights of Palestinian refugees to their properties in the part of historic Palestine that became Israel in 1948. In your book, you try to outline the various fora where Palestinians may seek to lodge claims against Israel for theft, in legal terms, expropriation of their properties and homes. Much has been written about the failures of international law's so-called universal principles and substantive human rights standards to protect the Palestinian people from the ongoing Nakba and genocide, or the role of international law and its institutions, such as the UN, in dispossessing Palestinians and depriving them of their internationally guaranteed rights. That was Professor Ardly Mc's book. Or about the ways in which law can be used at once to oppress or strategically as a tool to advance a political movement. And that was Professor Noura Araqat's book. Your book is an important contribution to the literature on the question of Palestine and international law, precisely because it tries to envisage mechanisms to practically fulfill Palestinian rights. In this particular case, property rights. I also appreciated how, while a lot of international law and Palestine-focused scholarly work is typically backward-looking, trying to assign patterns or make sense of what happened in the past, what you've done is you've essentially looked at the past in order to establish a certain body of rights that Palestinians are entitled to within the Green Line, and you lay out how, in future cases, those rights to Palestinian property within the Green Line may be fulfilled, the mechanisms that we can try to use to fulfill those rights. So to me, I think that's why this book is really unique and important, but I'm also curious to hear from you. Why did you feel it was important to write this book?
Thank you, Lara and Michael, to begin with, for inviting me. I've been a huge fan of the Palestine Pod, so it's great to be on it. Quite a privilege. Thank you both. So, I mean, when I wrote this book initially, I wrote it as a doctoral thesis quite a few years ago. And it was in large part cathartic. I'm the daughter of Palestinian refugees. My father is a Nakba survivor, and my mother was born in Lebanon to a family of Nakba survivors. So this was part of my upbringing. I always, knew that there was something different about our status as stateless Palestinian refugees, and I remember vividly all of the discussions and the oral history that I learned from my grandmother about Haifa and Akka. So I grew up well aware of that status of being a stateless Palestinian refugee, even though I was a very privileged stateless Palestinian refugee who happened to be born in the UK and not stateless. And so to me, I felt like I knew that I wanted to focus on the refugee issue. And I think when I visited the refugee camp, I realized how privileged I am and how different my life turned out to be from people who really literally could have been me. I mean, my parents were Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and my reality could have been entirely different. And so this prompted me to really focus my work and research on Palestinian refugees, starting with the LLM, which was about Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And then when I got the scholarship to write a PhD, I knew I wanted to write about the Palestinian refugee issue. And then with some Q&A, like questions and answers and conversations with a lot of people who were experts in that field, I realized that there was a gap in research on the right to reparation. And I thought, okay, that's the gap I'm going to fill. What's happening? Network connection lost.
Wow.
So
The Zionists will steal anything, huh? They really don't want to make it easy on us, huh? They said, oh, you want to do a podcast, DDoS attack. Okay.
One of the first themes that your book addresses is the mechanisms that were used to dispossess Palestinians of their lands and their properties by the British and later the Zionists. Now, of course, we know about the physical mechanisms, the force, the expulsion of Palestinians from their homes and lands. But there was also, in parallel to this, and also in the aftermath of the 1948 Nakba, there was also a body of legal and administrative acts that were taking place in the newly established state of Israel. And your book sort of lays out the ways in which that legislation and that early policymaking manipulated or sort of took advantage of certain gaps in law and administrative acts that existed prior. So can you explain what that looks like in practice and the ways in which Palestinians were dispossessed?
Sure. So essentially, during the Ottoman period, and as followers of your podcast would know, prior to the British mandate, we had the Ottoman Empire in Palestine, ruling Palestine for close to 400 years. 1858, they enacted a land code which had 5 categories of land, and the way that, without getting into the details, basically, but the way that the categorization of land ownership under the Ottoman rule was a little bit different from what you're used to in Western legal systems. So there was a category of land that was akin to private ownership, but then there are the other categories of land, which is the predominant category of land in Palestine, which is called miri. It comes from the word emir. It means that the sovereign retains interest in the property, but for as long as it's being cultivated, it remains under the ownership of the people who are cultivating it. And over time, while there were initially some restrictions on inheriting the property or disposing of it, and the owner still had to pay tax to the sovereign. Over time, there was a law that was adopted in 1913 that removed these restrictions, and so that category of land, which was the predominant category of land in Palestine, became akin to privately owned property, even though if in a strictly legal Western legal system, it probably isn't considered as such, because there's a vested interest that goes back, that is retained by the sovereign, kind of like a leasehold in the common law property. Like you've got a long leasehold and then it reverts, it cheats back to the crown. It was kind of a similar sort of thing. For as long as the land was being used, they retained the ownership, but then it reverted back to the sovereign. And then you had other categories of land that were kind of like communally owned land, one could say, and that's not unusual in other legal systems, and especially in indigenous native communities. If you look even in North America, or should call it Turtle Island, that's how land is communally owned. It wasn't like you didn't have a registration of a land with a plot that's clearly defined and so on. And so what happened is when the British mandate began in Palestine, there was a clash of paradigms between the Ottoman land ownership system and the British Western land system. And so that categorization kind of land ownership under the Ottoman rule opened up the opportunity for exploitation by the British and subsequently by the Israelis, because they use a typical settler colonial strategy, which is to consider land as public land, and therefore, it's terra nullius, it's public land, and therefore we'll expropriate it because it doesn't belong to anybody. When the opposite is true, is just that it was owned in a way that is dissimilar from the Western ownership laws, basically.
And to that point, shout out communism. Big fan. And that's like when native people in Turtle Island encountered colonial settlers, the settlers were like, "Do you own the land?" And the native people were like, "What are you talking about? You sound dumb." And they are. So.
And also, it wasn't just the question of ownership, it's also like the registration. Like Western models of ownership or Western legal systems are very focused on registration. Under the Ottoman Empire, the registration system was a register of transactions rather than a register of of title deeds. And also the owners were trying to reduce their exposure to taxes. So sometimes they did not declare the full land that they were actually owning, or they were inclined to register the land under the names of the large landowners. And so it was just a form of land ownership that is, or land system that is just different from Western legal systems. And so when the British came, instead of sorting out this mess, they added to it, as they typically do. And so what they did is they reformed the land registry system instead of completely revamping it, and proceeded to do a what they call the settlement of title process. But the issue is they didn't complete it before handing over the question of Palestine to the UN. And they were only able to give, let's say, a clear title to about 25% of the land in Palestine. They hadn't completed the rest of the work. And coincidentally, it raises questions actually as to the intention of the British mandate at the time. Their focus in terms of the registration of the land was in the part that eventually became the Jewish state. So it seems like they were kind of keen to give clear title to the areas of property that were owned by Jewish settlers. And so, at the end of the British mandate, only 25% of the land had undergone that process of registration. And then entered the Israeli legal regime, and they proceeded right away to use something that was not uncommon, by the way, but it was just used differently when it comes to the Palestinians, which was the doctrine of enemy property. So it wasn't uncommon in wars for warring parties to hold certain property belonging to the enemy under the custodianship of a custodian for property or for enemy property. It's a tactic that was used by the Brits against German assets, and it's a way to deprive your enemy from having access to assets during warfare. It's just to kind of like constrain them economically. And so they adopted a custodian of absentee property regulation to begin with, in which the property that belonged to so-called absentees, which could have been even Palestinians who were studying abroad during the Nakba and got stuck abroad and couldn't come back home. It's withheld that property, put it under the custodianship of the custodian of absentee property. And initially, the regulation that was initially adopted only allowed for long leases of property. But that didn't suit one of the main organizations responsible for Jewish settlement, which was the Jewish National Fund, which wanted to gain ownership. They were not interested in leases. They wanted to have full ownership. And so they kept pushing until that regulation became the absentee property law. And the absentee property law allowed the sale of property to the JNF, but also the disposal of that property to a so-called development authority. And so in that process, what you had is like severing the legal title to the Palestinians from the original owners, instead of holding the property under custody until there's a resolution to the dispute. I don't want to use the word conflict. And then, the property is returned to their owners. What happened is a process by which there was a severance of the legal title of the original owners to their property through that legal mechanism, which enabled the custodian of absentee property to sell the land subsequently to the state, and then the development authority and the JNF. And these were the three main property owners.
That's great insight. Thank you so much. I'd love to read a few quotes, actually. In 1936, Maurice Hexter, an executive at the Jewish Agency, explicitly stated the goal of the Jewish Agency was, quote, the herding together of the existing Arab villages and their concentration in order to evacuate their territories for Jewish colonization, force people to exchange land and move from one place to another. Our intention is that the Jewish settlements will only be for Jews. That sounds like it was written by Ben Gvir, huh? Anyways, another one. In 1948, the head of the Jewish Agency Population Transfer Committee, Yosef Weitz, met with Zionist terrorist leaders and said, quote, I made a summary of a list of Arab villages, which in my opinion must be cleared out in order to complete Jewish regions. I also made a summary of the places that have land disputes and must be settled by military means.
Mm-hmm. Both very important quotes. But I do want to say actually something that despite all of the flaws in the Ottoman legal system and how it was manipulated by the British and how the British contributed to some degree and to a large degree actually in facilitating the Jewish immigration and transfer of property. Despite all of that, I think it's important to note that at the end of the British Mandate, land ownership of the Jewish community was less than 7%. So, notwithstanding all of these issues, they still couldn't own more than 7% of the land. And I think that's an important point to make for more than one reason. First of all, the usual very racist accusation against Palestinians that they sold their land. Well, clearly they didn't. Actually, Sami Haddawi is a Palestinian historian and wrote a book on land property. He had done a survey of the major landowners and the major landowners, and there's definitely, I'm not assuming any bad faith, but a lot of them were actually Lebanese families who probably were investors. They were investing in Palestine, and they got a purchaser and they sold the property, and that was it. There was, it was a Surso family. I remember the name of the family. So one, to dispel that very racist argument, if anybody is still making that argument after seeing how Palestinians hang on to their property despite a genocide. But in addition to that, I think it's also important because it gives context as to why the partition plan was rejected. Because there again, there is this very racist argument that is constantly being made. That look at the Palestinians; they're inherently the rejectionists, and they just irrational people who just don't want to live with Jews, and that's obviously not why they rejected the partition plan. The partition plan was grossly unjust. It granted 52% of the land to 30% of the population who own 7% of the land. That's the context, and these are the facts, and that's why it's important to look at the property ownership and give that context around the partition plan. And also another thing actually that I wanted to mention about the British Mandate, what they did also is they dispatched a lot of commissions. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'm going to mention two that are probably the most famous. The most famous was the Peel Commission, which was the first commission that recommended the partition of Palestine. And the Peel Commission was in 1936, I believe, or 37. And that roughly coincided with the Great Arab Revolt, which is the Palestinians' first intifada, if you want to call it that. And no sooner had they submitted that or issued that recommendation, they started backtracking because they realized, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. And then it was followed in 1939 by the MacDonald White Paper, which recommended, guess what, a binational state. And so it's not novel now to come up with a binational state or a one-state solution or whatever. Quite the contrary, actually. The commissions who are looking at the situation there on the ground, they were saying, this is a disaster. We need to avert this. This is going to cause long-term turmoil and clashes between the Arab and Jewish communities. It's such a bad idea. And there was just one exception, which was the Peel Commission, which was reversed 2 years later by the MacDonald White Paper. And even when we look at the partition plan in the drafting history, there were actually two committees, and partition was just narrowly voted as the most suitable option. But it wasn't like a clear cut, partition is the best idea, let's just go for it. Quite the contrary.
Most importantly, Palestinians didn't go for it. Like the people that are deciding all of these things, deciding Palestinian fate are not Palestinians. So first of all, I mean, that in and of itself is evidence that their opinion doesn't really matter actually at all, because it's irrelevant what the UK and the US and Europe think about what should happen to Palestine. But so you've explained to us how Palestinians were deprived of their property and lands, legally speaking. So this leads us to what their rights are to their land back, to their property back, to return, because an injustice has been committed against them. So I think the question that follows from your introduction is, what are Palestinians entitled to under international law faced with this factual context? For practitioners of international law, we know that in the case of an internationally wrongful act committed by a state, victims are entitled to something called full reparation. So what does full reparation look like in a context of Nakba, in particular, where one of the main crimes is the land theft and the expulsion of nearly an entire society?
So I focus mainly on reparations for the property losses. I actually, when I first started researching this topic, I wanted to look at the Nakba holistically and think of, I want reparations for everything, for the displacement, the war crimes, the rape, the torture, the intergenerational trauma and all of that. But, sadly, international law does not really have a crime called intergenerational trauma or, so many other things. And it was and it was such a complex topic to address, to just, talk about reversing a historical injustice as a whole. And so I decided to focus primarily on property. And so the answers that I'm going to give are reparations in relation to property specifically, not for the Nakba as a whole, because I think this is a whole other, set of research. And more importantly, it's an ongoing violation. It's an ongoing wrongful act because the Nakba is ongoing. And that's one thing that when I first started researching, I thought it was, a moment in time with a beginning and an end, only to realize over time that it's an ongoing, it's a process, as Professor Ardim Says and Rabia Aghbari refer to it, a structure, a framework. It is certainly not a one-time historical event of displacement and dispossession. But if we look at the property claims in particular, and I think the grounds for reparations, you've got grounds under, as you correctly pointed it out, under the laws of state responsibility. But I'm not going to go too much into that because it's very, legal and a bit dry. And I have to talk about something called the intertemporal rule, and I'll lose the audience. But I do want to talk
actually,
about...
our audience loves the intertemporal rule. Our audience has told us time and time again, talk more about intertemporal. What is that? They serve that at Japanese restaurants, right?
Yeah, it sounds like that, right? So, it's actually, it was a real pain as I was doing my research. This intertemporal rule essentially states that you cannot judge facts that occur at a certain point in time using laws that didn't exist at that point in time. And therefore, I couldn't look at the Nakba and what happened in 47 leading up to the Nakba 48, 49, etc., and say, oh, but there was a violation of the Convention on Genocide because it had just been adopted. And so all of the events that happened before it were not under the Genocide Convention. And so for property expropriation, I couldn't resort to the Geneva Conventions because they were being like adopted and drafted. I had to go way back to the Hague Conventions of 1907, and see, this is where I'll be losing your audience.
This sounds like comedians who used to tell racist jokes being like, you can't judge me by then, like it was the time period, like everybody was saying that stuff, like
everybody was doing it, right?
But you joke about that, but that is the case, by the way. Now that we're talking about population transfers in the 1920s were legal. That's the thing. There were slavery was legal at one point. So, population transfers were legal in the 1920s. It was part of the research I was looking at. There was the Greco-Bulgarian and the Greco-Turkish transfers of property, which by the way, Israel uses as an argument to say, well, we took on some Jewish refugees and therefore there was a population transfer. It was by then it was illegal, but B, because of everything that happened, like the Holocaust and so on. But more importantly, there was no, in order to have a population transfer, usually it's like two countries, two states that agree. Not that it makes it less horrific because the individuals did not really have a say in it. But if you look historically, like Greece and Bulgaria entered into a treaty, and they roughly exchanged the same number of people. I hate to be referring to people like that, but that's more or less what had happened. And so, yes, it's we joke about it, but yeah. at some point in time, population transfers were legal. But the norms of international law changed over time. Thank God. It looks like we're going back into a reversal right now of the laws. But yeah, I mean, it's a joke, but it's also a very valid one. And so for me, in terms of, to get back to what I focused on to demonstrate the grounds for reparations, I did look at the law on state responsibility and the Hague Conventions and all of that, but I also looked at the UN resolutions. And I think it was, it's one of the things that I enjoyed writing the most. I looked at the drafting history of Resolution 194. And if we look at the drafting history, we see what the intention of the parties was, and we see things like the element of choice, that this is an individual right. This is a choice that every individual refugee has to exercise. And we see reference to return and compensation. They are not mutually exclusive. Those who return should be able to also get compensated for the losses and damages. And those who choose not to return are entitled to compensation. And so implicitly, those who return would have a right to restitution. It says, resolves that the refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return, and for loss of or damage to property which, under principles of international law or in equity, should be made good by the governments or authorities responsible. So here we know, first of all, wishing to return to their home. So this is a choice. It's an individual choice. Note the use of the word homes. And if we look at the drafting history, there was actually a proposal by, I believe, Guatemala to say the areas from which they came, and it was rejected. So the intention was really to restitute the property and return the individual to their home. And therefore, if you suggest to somebody who is a refugee in Lebanon and fled Haifa, Raqqa, like my parents, to go back to Tulkarem, that's actually not a return to one's home. That's a form of internal displacement. The return is to one's home and village. And in order, like, if you look at the drafting history, you realize that was the intention of the drafter, is really a return to one's home, not to the areas from which they were displaced. There was another thing that the resolution refers to, is that at the earliest practicable date. And there was an argument that, okay, well, what does that mean? Is it like when there will be an eventual peace agreement, etc.? And I want to read to you what the British and surprisingly the American delegates had to say about that. So the argument was that, if they're saying at the earliest practicable date, then the return cannot materialize until a formal regional peace agreement is reached. But this was not the intention of the drafters. In fact, Guatemala, again, had submitted an amendment which would have required parties in Palestine to declare peace before refugees are permitted to return to their homes. But the amendment was opposed by the UK, United Kingdom representative, who noted the fact that it might be many years before a formal peace was established in Palestine. But check this out. This is what the United States delegate said. They were not in favor of that amendment either. And they said his delegation could not accept the proclamation of peace as a prerequisite for the return of refugees, and hoped that the assembly would not make this a condition. It was recognized that the bulk of the refugees could only return in peaceful circumstances. However, they need not wait for the proclamation of peace before beginning. These unfortunate people should not be made pawns in the negotiations for a final settlement. Can you believe that this is what the US delegate said at the time? And how far we've come in terms of policy, where now we are being used as pawns.
No, I can't believe that. What explains that? I don't know. I mean, what explains that? I mean, I guess it's true that no, but the absence of AIPAC, is that what that was?
That was at a time when the Zionist lobby was just getting introduced into the American political system and did not have a stranglehold on every single politician. They were already like there, and they were working towards like the established, like they were already ingrained, but not in full control.
And also probably it's because this is like, we're talking like 2-3 years after the end of the Second World War. So, we're entering this era where we don't want to be in another conflict or something, so they're trying to be, they're being relatively reasonable. Mine is the fact that they, partitioned the land and sowed the seeds of strife and so on. But they were also building on the recommendations of Comte Folke Bernadotte, who was assassinated by the Israelis because of how strong his recommendations were. Resolution 194 is, largely inspired and built on his recommendations. So this is, I suppose this was the atmosphere at the time, which is, okay, let's, we want to create that state and we want to resolve the issue of, the Jews having a homeland, etc. But we also don't want to create too much trouble in this part of the world, and so perhaps that's what would explain that when you look at the drafting history, you're like, oh, actually, it's not so bad. Had it been implemented, it wouldn't. I want to say it would have been fine. It wouldn't have been fine, but it wouldn't have been that awful had it actually been implemented.
So you discovered something interesting, Lena, about the portion of the resolution 194, which reads, "Who wish to live at peace with their neighbors." Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so that's another good point. So some argue that this is a requirement for the Israelis to request assurances from the Palestinians that they would be willing to live at peace before allowing them to return, kind of like a precondition. But again, when I dug into the drafting history, it's actually the opposite. It's that Palestinians have to be given assurances that they will be able to live at peace. And so yeah, it's fascinating that the more I started looking into the drafting history, the more I was able to unveil about Resolution 194, which is a seminal resolution. Anybody who's working on Palestinian refugees would have to read it. That paragraph that I read is paragraph 11 of Resolution 194, but also Resolution 194 establishes the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine, UNCCP, which is not as well known as UNRWA, but it took over basically the role of the assassinated mediator. It was supposed to be the mediation, commission that's in charge of finding a solution for Palestinian refugees. Unfortunately, its efforts were frustrated because there was just no political will, and it just kept hitting challenges and stumbling blocks. It ceased to function, although it continues to exist. Like you would have a site for it on the UN's portal on the question of Palestine. But the UNCCP did play a role, since we're talking about reparations, in resolving the issue of the blocked bank accounts. So that is the one thing that Palestinians did receive reparations for. Those who had bank accounts were able to retrieve them, but it was unable to resolve the issue of the property claims, or facilitate the return of the refugees, or like a durable solutions for Palestinian refugees. But another thing that it also did, and I highly recommend Professor Michael Fischbach's book, Records of Dispossession, to look at the history, to learn more about the history of the UNCCP. And he actually, I owe him for opening my eye to the gap in academic research on reparations. He had just finished writing his book, and he said, well, if you want to write about something, you got to explore this angle of what I wrote about. He's a historian, but from a legal perspective, just look at what happened with reparations. So in his book, he also notes that the UNCCP, what it did is that it kind of like finished the work of the British mandate. It started gathering the titles and the deeds and looking at like mapping out basically the deeds and the ownership of land in Palestine, and these documents were digitally scanned and archived. And I believe, according to I think my last conversation with Professor Fischbach, is that there is a copy in the UN for sure. I think there are two other copies. I can't remember if it was, one with the British government and another with the Palestinians or the Jordanians or something like that. But these digital copies do exist. So we have a full survey of the title and ownership of land in Palestine, just sitting somewhere gathering dust until there is political will to do something about it.
So this brings us to looking forward towards the future. For descendants of Nakba survivors who may be listening to us, what should they know if they are thinking about one day maybe bringing a claim? Do they have the standing to bring claims in court for stolen property against Israel, let's say assuming their parents or grandparents who are the original owners have passed away? What is it that today's, youth should know about being descendants of Nakba survivors from the perspective of how to actually assert these claims?
So excellent question. And actually, I wrote my book trying to find answers to it. And I hope that those who will read it will find answers to it. But I will say a few things about this. So first of all, obviously, if you have a title deed, if you have any kind of record, hold on to it. Super important for whenever we reach a point where there is political will to enforce a right to reparation. Second of all, I would say UNRWA has been doing an incredible work as well, an effort to digitize the records of Palestinians. As a registered Palestinian refugee with UNRWA, because my parents were registered with UNRWA, and this is why UNRWA is under attack, I found out last year that there is an app, and I recommend that everybody who is registered with UNRWA and descendant of a registered with UNRWA download this app called e-UNRWA, where you can get access to your records. And I was able to actually view the very first document that documented the entry of my grandfather at the border in Lebanon. And it says, place of origin, Akka. And it has like the names of his kids, including my dad and their age. Download this app because you can have access to your records. It's just important to have that record keeping, basically, just to make sure that you've got that record that you are a descendant of a Palestinian refugee.
I did not think that your first thing that you were going to say is there's an app for that, though.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't actually know about it either. I was kind of like asking, some people I knew at UNRWA, and they're like, you should, because last time I worked briefly at UNRWA, and then I went and I got like a copy of my card, the UNRWA card, and all of that, which was pretty special. But I hadn't seen the records, like the historical records of when my family first crossed the border into Lebanon. And then to know that there was an app that you can enter and have access to information about your family and how many kids there are and who was registered with UNRWA is pretty special. And it doesn't take a lot of time. You just need to have your original UNRWA card. Go ask your dad or whoever might have it for the number, and then it takes like a few minutes and you get access to it. And they've spent a lot of time doing this work. Really appreciate it. Besides that, in terms of where do you invoke it? So I do dedicate a whole chapter about this issue, but I'm going to try and sum up the key points. I totally understand the urge to want to go to a domestic court. I wish it were that simple. And as a British citizen, I wish I could just go and sue the UK. But unfortunately, there are, as you would know, Lara, also as a lawyer, there are a lot of jurisdictional barriers to that. And there are things like, sovereign immunity, there's, standing. If you want to go to a US court, but you weren't an American citizen at the time, so what's the nexus to the US? There are statutes of limitations. There's obviously the costs. There are a lot of factors that would make it very challenging. And this is why, with the exception of the Holocaust reparations, which I look at and I explain why it's not a precedent, what were the circumstances that made it successful. If you look at Black reparations, cases for Black reparations in the States, or slavery, or Native Americans, or Japanese interns, you will find that they actually weren't successful in domestic courts because of all of these like procedural obstacles. This is not to say that there is nothing to be done with domestic courts. I think in order to have strategic litigation, you have to go after organizations that continue to contribute to the dispossession of Palestinians, like the Jewish National Fund, and target, for example, their charitable status. And this was a strategy that actually bore fruits in Canada. The JNF was stripped of its charitable status recently. And this actually encouraged the UK, the ICJP, the International Center for Justice for Palestine, I think is what it stands for, to submit a request to the Attorney General in the UK to strip the JNF of its charitable status. So domestic courts can be used for a purpose. It's just not not to resolve mass claims. just because they're also think of like the millions of claims and the knowledge, the very specific knowledge that these judges would have to in order to be able to resolve these claims. And also there are issues with the discrepancy in the lack of uniformity in the rulings, because if somebody files in France and then the other refugee files in Australia, etc., the rulings might be entirely different. There's also the danger of raising expectations. The chances of success may not be always great, and so you can raise expectation, but then disappoint people, and also how it would be read by public opinion, that then they don't have a claim. Look at that, they lost their case. So there are lots of challenges that led me to conclude that it's not the best avenue. Also, the accessibility. It would be accessible to the wealthy Palestinians, but not to the majority of the Palestinians. The majority of the Palestinians were peasants. They were not, property owners from the bourgeoisie, would be able to file a case in the UK and spend thousands of dollars or pounds trying to get reparations. So for all of these reasons, I don't think that domestic courts are the best forum to resolve mass claims for dispossession. Historically, if we look at precedents, the best forum usually is a mass claims commission, kind of like what you had in Bosnia, in Kosovo. And there, you can ensure uniformity. It's accessible for everybody. There are pros and cons, and there are lessons to learn, and still a protracted process. It takes years and years to go through them. But there are mechanisms also to have, like, for example, expedited cases for people who are, let's say, not landowners. And you'll have, a certain amount, let's say, that's dispersed to each and every one of them. And then you'd have, another category of claims for the more complex owners of industries or factories or whatnot, and so on and so forth. I mean, there are different models, but it would have to be a mass claims tribunal. And that's something that would happen eventually, inshallah, if we reach a point where you would have the political will to resolve this issue once and for all in a just way. You would have a mass claims commission. You would have probably some equivalent of a truth and reconciliation commission. And you would also have the equivalent of a dedicated criminal tribunal to try the war criminals. That's kind of like the model.
Yeah, I think that's a really good explanation of just sort of managing expectations of people in terms of how they can use these mechanisms and where they might actually be able to lodge a claim. And it may not be today, but to also have those conversations in your family, know what evidence does exist in your family, make sure it's with someone who's trusted and who can assert that right when the time comes, and keep passing it down to your children, because the right will go to the descendants. That it's not a right that can be extinguished, and the time will come for this to be dealt with sooner or later. We're not going away. When you see the advisory opinion of the ICJ of July, and you see that the court has ordered reparations for Israel's internationally wrongful conduct in the OPT starting since 1967, one would think that perhaps a commission of this sort is the next logical step, at least when it comes to enforcing the advisory opinion, which I know deals with something other than what your book deals with. It deals with the OPT and not within the Green Line. But perhaps that would be, sort of a first place where we could see this model play out with respect to Palestine. Of course, as you mentioned, the one factor which is going to determine whether or not any of this happens is the political will. And at the moment, it doesn't exist with respect to the global north, the US, Europe, which still continue to dominate outcomes. But it's not always going to be that way. I want to turn now to current events, because I think it's important to connect everything that we're speaking to, which has a historical dimension, but also an ongoing dimension, to what's been happening in the last couple of days. We've seen in the last couple of weeks the implementation of the first phase of the hostage exchange. It's being referred to in the news as a ceasefire. My own personal view is that it's not a ceasefire, as Israel has only slowed its killing of Palestinians in Gaza. In fact, it's actually accelerated its killing of Palestinians and destruction of their property in the West Bank. As part of this hostage exchange, we've seen thousands of Palestinians who have been forcibly displaced from their homes in Gaza for the last 15 months march back to the northern part of Gaza. And in most cases, they're returning to rubble. We know that as part of Israel's genocide, they have destroyed over 90% of the homes in Gaza. And Palestinians in Gaza are now testifying to a lack of food and water in the northern parts of Gaza. It's not being flooded with aid as it should have, further to the first phase of this hostage exchange. Palestinians continue to testify that Israel is blocking delivery of tents. They're desperate for reconstruction to begin so that they can live in dignity. And yet, instead of that, the discourse that exists in the mainstream media, in the global north, in the US right now, is one which is the opposite of all of that. Trump calling openly in the last couple of days for, quote, emptying Gaza of Palestinians, saying that the US should control Gaza, and making numerous references to the development opportunities that he sees in Gaza. So I'm curious to your views on what we're seeing, in this moment. And I think one important thing to start out with is just to say that this is not different than what Palestinians have experienced for the last 76 years. The Palestinian lived experience is one of being uprooted and dispossessed and forcibly displaced. And so the proposition is outlandish and outrageous, but if people are disturbed by that, then wait till we tell them what happened during the Nakba, right? Because this is really only a proposal to continue the Nakba, of course, much more openly and it's much more abrasive in the way that he said it. But I'm curious to get your views.
I think you said it actually, Lara. When the ceasefire announcement happened, I think everybody in our community was struggling with all sorts of competing emotions, like conflicting, emotions. On one hand, we were happy to see that bombs were not falling daily on Palestinians in Gaza, but on the other, the scale of the devastation and the knowledge that the genocide is not because the bombs are not raining down on people that the genocide has ended, and that's essentially it. It's that this is part of a continuum, and the genocide was like the Nakba is, again, the structure, a process. It's ongoing, and it just ebbs and it flows. And there are just instances where it's at an accelerated pace, which is what we had during the genocide, and it's then it goes into a slow pace, slow drip, form of ethnic cleansing, and now potentially maybe another accelerated phase. But it is a continuum. I think this is what we're currently witnessing is just that. It's that the Nakba is ongoing, and I think this is why I also focus on the rights of refugees and wrote my book on the rights of refugees, because I think it is important for all of us, including and primarily starting with the Palestinian community, to go back to the origins, because us too, in the way we've been addressing this issue, sadly, especially since Oslo, but also since 1988 to some degree, we were looking at it as the issue of the occupation. And let's just end the occupation. And then we broadened it. They said, okay, let's end the occupation and end apartheid. But actually, it's broader than that. We need to end the Nakba as a whole. And the Nakba as again, I refer to what Ighbari wrote, it's all of those things. It's not just genocide, and it's not just apartheid, and it's not just occupation. We need a word to describe what has happened to us as a nation, and that's Nakba in all of the multiple facets of it. And so if we really want to, resolve this issue, we have to go back to the core, which is the theft of a nation and everything that has happened since. And so I think what is happening is incredibly, dangerous, and it's a pivotal moment for us as a nation, but also perhaps a very rude awakening that we're either, all Palestinians are either refugees or refugees to be, and therefore we have to be constantly focusing on this issue and on the origins and centering it back to that. And our demands should not be just end the occupation or end apartheid, it's end the Nakba. لابد للنكبة أن تنتهي. That would be, my take on what he's saying. I have no idea how to resolve it or how to handle it yet. I think we're all still processing, what is the best way to address all of these, statements. The primary thing to focus on in our advocacy work is really that, is just centering it back to say this is part of a continuum. This is the Nakba. This is not just one episode, this is part of it, because then we can resolve it better, I think.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. I mean, I think the point about the continuum, this proposal doesn't arise from, it's not coming out of a vacuum. It continuing.
Didn't fall out of a coconut tree. Thank you so much.
It's continuing the Palestinian experience for the last 76 years. And I think there's no greater proof than just the demographic of Gaza itself. 80% of Palestinians in Gaza are not from Gaza, but they're from land that is today in what constitutes Israel. And that may be an uncomfortable truth for Zionists, but that's a fact. That's where they're from. That's where they have the right to return to. If they're going to go anywhere, it's going to be to their homes and lands that are, just a few kilometers away while Gaza is rebuilt. And it will be rebuilt because of a Palestinian-led vision, because Gaza is part of Palestine. It belongs to Palestinians. And if the right of self-determination of Palestinians, especially and in particular in the OPT, which has been recognized and affirmed over and over and over again, can be so easily dispensed with, by just, a few sentences saying, oh, well, they're just going to leave, it's no problem. They're going to leave. We're going to take over. It really means nobody's safe. Nobody in this world is safe. If the right of self-determination, which is the most, sacred right of a people to determine their own future, can just be so quickly evaporated like that, then it's a really, really unfortunate state of affairs. And I think, one other thing I want to say about this in particular is that it's also a continuation of that annihilation of international law that we've seen with the genocide, the notion that we were unable to prevent the genocide, that the mechanisms that are in place, the treaties that are in place, all the law that exists, none of it was enough to protect Palestinians from daily bombardment, starvation, slaughter, their families displaced, being bombed in their tents, watching their skin melt. I mean, these are things that we witness day in and day out, and the Palestinians live day in and day out for 15 months. And nothing that we thought would save us, that was intended to prevent these types of mass atrocities, it's now morphing. It's now continuing to, okay, we committed a genocide in front of the world for 15 months and we got away with it, or we're getting away with it. Now what else can we do? Where can we go from here? And so I see this proposal as sort of like testing the waters for something even more outrageous. And we do an expulsion event of 2 million people in front of the world. And could it work? Oh, okay, if we can, then what else can we get away with, right? And so that's why we need to vigorously reject this and resist this, with every fiber of our being. Because we're really, waking up every day and seeing that outcomes are being determined by powerful entities who subscribe to absolutely no rule book. No idea is too outlandish. And, even just Trump's obsession with the money that he can make off of Gaza. It's perfect colonial logic. There's nothing new here. And so it shouldn't really surprise any of us, because we've seen this time and again. I think, it's really important for all of us to resist and reject these proposals and to support Palestinians who remained for 15 months on their land despite all odds. And I think that's something that we can't, overemphasize enough. Like, Palestinians remained on their land. In the very beginning of the genocide, the Zionists were talking about forcibly displacing Palestinians, sending them off to different countries. They had Danny Danon on a press tour saying, oh, countries will take them. Don't worry. We're going to encourage voluntary, migration. Their obsession with calling it voluntary, even though we don't consent. They keep calling it voluntary in any event, even though we expressly do not agree. But it didn't work. It didn't work.
On the point of voluntary expulsion, I think they really lack creativity, because if you look at what they say about the Nakba, they also say, well, they left. It's like, we didn't expel them. They just left because they wanted to leave and they were told by the Arabs to leave. And so they left voluntarily. And so you see that they just recycle the same arguments that they used decades ago. And now they're saying, well, no, they will leave because, they will leave. But yeah, well, because you've made their lives miserable, because essentially now a Palestinian in Gaza has one of two options. Either they die in their homeland or they live in forced exile. That's the option. These are the options. There is no option of living in their homeland, or that's where we're heading. Basically, it's either you die there, and that's why they were saying, I can't remember which of the army generals was saying that whoever leaves for treatment is not coming back. And so look at the choice that a Palestinian has to make. It's like, either I'm just going to die of that disease because there's just no treatment in Gaza, or I'm just going to relinquish my homeland in order to get treated and live. These are the options that Palestinians are facing. One thing that I found interesting is how, when you were arguing with Zionists, they were always saying, well, it's just a war, like, it's not really demolished. It's like, it's just a war. And now, like, it's really a demolition site, and it's so awful and it's so terrible. No one can really live there. So which is it? Was it just like typical warfare or what? Or did you really render it unlivable? So there is this contradiction in their arguments of like, no, they play it down like it's nothing happened. It's just like Ukraine. Well, okay, well then why don't we transfer the Ukrainians? Poor Ukrainians. Why do we want Ukrainians to stay in Ukraine if it's the same level of warfare? Why won't Poland take them? But no, it's always like, it's the Palestinian exceptionalism. And on this point of the Palestinian exceptionalism in refugee law, I think it's very important to also point out, especially now with all the attacks on UNRWA and talks about whether UNHCR should assume some of the responsibility, etc. And I remember I worked briefly for UNHCR in Amman after the war on Iraq, the second war on Iraq, and I was working in the so-called durable solutions department or resettlement department, and that's where you have an interview with the refugee. They've already been recognized as refugee. They were asylum seekers. They were granted refugee status, and then they come to the durable solutions department, and then you determine what are the options for them. We were always told to remind the refugee that we're not a travel agency. You're not going to come and tell us, I want to go to Australia, or I'd like to be resettled to the States or Norway or whatever. The preferred solution, and the only solution that they have as of right, is the right to voluntarily repatriate. The other two, which is local integration and resettlement, are not rights. They are subject to the jurisdiction of the host country or the resettlement country. The only country that has an obligation is the one that has to repatriate them, except when it comes to the Palestinians. So while we were telling, Iraqis, as soon as Saddam Hussein's regime fell, even though Iraq was not safe, we were supposed to tell the Iraqis, encourage them to voluntarily repatriate, because this is all you've got as of right. And even though it wasn't actually necessarily safe, like this was their right. That's the only right that they had. They had no right to come to the UNHCR, knock on our doors, and say, we want to be resettled in the States. That's not how it worked. Except for the Palestinians, we are the only refugee group where we want to return, but we are precluded from returning, and we are forced to accept either full integration, which is not really an option at the moment, but at some point, let's say Jordan did locally integrate the refugees initially in 48, or resettlement. And that's, again, a case of the Palestinian exception. Everybody has the right to return and is discouraged from resettling or staying in a host country. And the Palestinians want their right to return, but they're asked and forced to resettle elsewhere.
So, yeah, Jewish people have a right to return to a place they've never been.
That too, that's another exception.
Yeah, pretty wild stuff.
This is even what early Zionists discussed in their writings, which was, what are we going to do with all the people that are here, in the land where we want to build this state? Well, we could, they spoke about Eventually, they're going to have to leave. Before that, they were saying, well, maybe we can help them get jobs in other countries. Maybe we can encourage them to go. Maybe we can just talk to them and convince them to move elsewhere and give them some money.
Yes, I have the quote right here, actually.
You do?
Go for it.
Theodore Herzl wrote in his diary in 1895, quote, "When we occupy the land, we shall bring immediate benefits to the state that receives us. We must expropriate gently the private property on the estates assigned to us. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our own country. The property owners will come over to our side. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly." That is Theodore Herzl in 1895.
Yeah, that's exactly the quote that I was thinking of.
Spirit the penniless population.
The penniless population, exactly. Which is funny because we weren't even penniless. Like, we were not penniless. This is what they always do, is they always try to paint the territory that they colonize as, just this desperate, desolate desert with, tumbleweed. And Palestine is rich, and Palestine was fertile, and Palestine's land had been worked for thousands of years by Palestine's people.
If the Palestinian people were penniless, how did the Zionists steal all their money?
Exactly.
We should end on a slightly better.
I know.
Yeah, we
usually do. I'm curious, in the research to your book, while you were writing this book, did you meet Palestinians who were eager to exercise their right to return and to have their property back? Like, what is your assessment of Palestinians in exile and their connection to their land despite their distance to it?
It's something that I didn't encounter in my legal research, just because I remember something about the legal studies that is frustrating, is that when I mentioned to my supervisors that I wanted to go and do field study in the camps in Jordan, and they said, go for sure, but it's just going to be anecdotal because this is not an anthropology thesis. It's not a thesis in on oral history or whatever. So for legal purposes, I mean, it's great, you can go, but you can just use it for anecdotal purposes. I didn't undertake a field study of refugees and what they felt like. And I know that at the time there was a very controversial poll by the Shqaqi, Khalil Shqaqi, I can't remember his institute, if it's the University of Jerusalem or Quds University or something. Poll suggests that only 30% of Palestinians wanted to return, but I think there were also a lot of issues with the way the questions were framed, because they were framed as in, do you want to return to destitute land, or would you rather take money and settle in Beirut? And, a lot of people would be like, well, you know what, I've been here for 3 generations. Maybe I'll just take the money and settle here, and I'll become a Lebanese citizen, and everything else, you sort out all my paperwork and the way it was framed was very problematic. I don't remember the exact details, but I remember it was very controversial at the time, because it was almost trying to suggest that most Palestinians would not want to return, and therefore the way that the negotiations are going in terms of marginalizing the refugee issue and focusing on compensation as opposed to return is the right way to do it, because it really just translates the will of the refugee population. So to answer your question, I didn't personally do any research, but I think we have the past 16 months or so, we've really seen where Palestinians stand, and we've seen the younger generation being even more vocal than the older generation, because they're also a lot more empowered. They understand the systems that they're working in. They are no longer the first immigrant who didn't want to get involved in politics. They're vocal, and they're empowered, and they see the intersectionality between the different issues, and they were able to connect the dots and work with indigenous groups and Black movements and LGBTQ and whatnot. They knew how to navigate that system, and they came out louder than their ancestors in demanding their right to return and reparations and restitution and so on. So I am hopeful because of that young generation, although I am also very concerned about the wave of repression, especially in the US, but also in Germany, elsewhere, and even actually here in the UK. I mean, our last demonstration was heavily policed for no reason. It was a peaceful demonstration, but still heavily policed, and over 70 people were detained for no reason. So I do worry about that, but I also we have no we don't have the choice of not being hopeful. So we have to remain hopeful and do everything that we can and continue to advocate and agitate and demonstrate and do everything that we can to help prevent the worst case scenario, but also more importantly, to go back to what we were saying all along, to really focus on ending the Nakba once and for all. That's what we should be really galvanizing all of our energy towards.
That seems like a better place to end, huh?
Yeah.
Lena, thank you so much for coming on the pod, and thank you so much for all your scholarship, all your work that you're contributing to the Palestinian liberation movement. We so appreciate your voice and everything that you're doing.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. Folks, that's been another episode of the Palestine Pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Check out our full episodes and sources at www.palestinepod.com. Follow us on Instagram at The Palestine Pod. Send us an email at palestinepod@gmail.com. And please support us on Patreon, www.patreon.com/PalestinePod. That has been another episode of the pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Have as good a day as you can.
We can start telling people to join the Patreon. The show wouldn't be possible without a Patreon. You got to get on our Patreon. Support us on Patreon. You can, because I've been watching all these other podcasts and they just keep plugging Patreon all the time.
Yeah, I'm going to clip what you just did right now.
Okay.